Let's talk about Sydney Banks and the three principles. This is Jurgen Rasmussen, by the way. Welcome to my channel. If someone were to ask me, based upon my 28 years in this profession of coaching and helping people, if someone were to ask me if I could only have one particular framework and to only have insights into one particular framework out of all the frameworks that I've studied, I would choose the three principles, hands down, no doubt. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about both why I think this particular framework is so powerful and what I perceive to be the strengths and the weaknesses of how people tend to coach based upon these frameworks and the implications that people draw from these principles. I was first introduced to the three principles back in either 2011 or 2012. I was in London with my good friend Wayne Marsh, and we were invited to Jamie Smart, who's one of the more well-known teachers of the principles today. At the time, he was active in the NLP world, and he had this podcast. And he interviewed me for the podcast. So we were in Jamie Smart's apartment in London. And at this particular time, Jamie was getting out of the NLP industry and was in fact running his last ever NLP master practitioner. And he said that he had discovered something completely new. And I asked him, what is it? And we had a conversation over his kitchen table. And I didn't get it at all. To me, it just sounded like a religion of sorts. So I left that meeting feeling kind of confused. And then a year later, or maybe a year and a half, I read online about the three principles, and I saw that Jamie had written a book about it called Clarity. So I thought, people are raving about this. And since it's Jamie, I might as well go and get the book. So I read the book. And this is interesting because in the book, Jamie wrote about the Lumiere brothers, the pioneers in photography who created the most magical moment in movie history. The first ever movie, black and white, no sound, right? This was back in 1895. It was a movie of a train moving into a train station. And allegedly, quite a few of the people in the audience jumped from their seats in terror, terrified to get run over by the train. Now, this was a story I had read about earlier in Daniel Goleman's book, Social Intelligence. He used it as an example of how moods can be contagious. But the way Jamie wrote about this story, and obviously what I heard, created a profound awakening for me at that point into the illusory nature of thought. It was a life-changing moment. Now, mind you, this was back in 2013. At that time, I had already spent 15 years professionally seeing clients through a neurolinguistic programming framework. I studied hypnosis. I'd studied developmental psychology. I'd studied rational emotive behavior therapy. I'd spent a lot of time studying how we construct our experience. And I was heavily into Byron Katie's The Work. But despite this, I saw something way deeper. And what really got to me was this notion that, hey, the people who leaped from their seats, you could, if you were to, let's say, help them to not have that experience, what really was going on was that they misunderstood the nature of film. And that the reason that you and I never leap from our seats when the train seems to come towards us is that we have a different understanding of how film works. And out of that understanding, we never freak out no matter what we feel or no matter what seems to be happening during the movie, because in the back of our mind, we know that the whole thing was a thought-generated illusion. At that particular time, I had a deep insight into that's how life works. Like everything I seem to experience is a thought generated illusion. So, a couple of things became very apparent right then and there. One of them was that, of course, that the feelings I experienced were always a barometer of the thinking in the moment. And it I knew in that moment that I would never approach client work the same way ever again. It completely lost its appeal to spend my time essentially trying to help people to change the submodalities of the movie, so to speak, or to change the structure of the experience, or to work with the content of experience, if I could help people to actually discover the nature of film. So my work became about helping people to discover the illusory nature of thought. It made my work on balance way more effective, uh, easier. And another huge benefit that came from that too is that clients did no longer have the tendency to attribute the changes to me or to techniques, but they attributed it to their own level of insight. Something else that also happened to me. So in that period, I went into the three principles as deeply as I could. In addition to Jamie's book at the time, I started reading stuff by George and Linda Pransky, Michael Neal, Dicken Bettinger, Elsie Spittle, Sydney Banks. I started to listen to all sorts of interviews I could find online. And throughout the years, I went to conferences and I trained with a bunch of these people, including Jack Pransky, George and Linda Pransky, Dicken Bettinger, William Pettit, uh, Elsie Spittle. And I, especially around that time of 2013, 2014, 2015, just kept having insight after insight after insight, right? Now, Sydney Banks, by the way, lived in Canada. He was a welder, originally from Scotland, with just a ninth degree education. And in the early 70s, he was struggling with a lot of anxiety, a lot of insecurities. His marriage was in a bad place. And he and his wife went to this couples retreat. And he said to a psychologist there that I'm just so insecure. And the psychologist shot back something to the effect of, Sid, you're not insecure, you just think you are. And at that moment, Sid's world exploded, and he had a deep insight into thought being the principle behind what he seemed to experience moment by moment. The principle of thought. Obviously, he heard something way more profound and more deep than the psychologist intended. And then a few days later, he had an additional insight, which was an experience where the boundaries between what seemed to be him and his body and the world seemed to dissolve. So he had that kind of non dual awakening of it all being one. And based upon this, he came up with this notion that there's three universal spiritual gifts and principles behind psychology, one of them being the principle of mind. And the principle of mind is just the intelligence, the formless intelligence behind all life, that which everything emerges out of. The other principle was the principle of consciousness, consciousness being that which allows you to have experience. And the final one being the principle of thought. So that which takes the formless, the pure formless energy and seemingly turns it into form or seemingly into something, that a subject can experience as an object, being the principle of thought. So, I was going to say something else that happened to me too was that this notion of working with thoughts and working with feelings also completely lost its appeal, right? Why would you have to do that? You can just leave your thoughts and feelings alone. So there's a lot of strengths, I think, to this particular paradigm. It is the deepest shift that I have experienced, alongside seeing that there's no such thing as a self, which happened for me in early 2017. Um, and I think that Sydney Banks is fundamentally right. I think that these are principles. And I'm very open minded, so if anyone disagrees with that, I would love to hear the basis of the disagreement, right? Um, but in terms of change work, there's a lot of big strengths in this because what Sydney Banks taught and what people who are influenced by the three principles tend to help their clients to see is that pretty much all psychological distress and suffering is just us misunderstanding the role of thought. That's it. Essentially, we think stuff up and we forget that it's a thought. So it looks like reality and it looks like who we are. And then we tend to try to work on those thoughts and fix those thoughts and analyze our feelings, which typically just adds more meaning and more significance to those experiences and decreases and increases our levels of suffering. So, someone who works based upon a three principles paradigm isn't really so much looking to help someone change what they think or how they think, or merely change their relationship to their thinking, but they're looking to help someone discover the fact that they're thinking, the thought as a principle. That's a different ball game to play. And there's no techniques in the three principles. There's no implication that you have to do anything to your thoughts and feelings. It's just a matter of waking up to it and understanding the mechanism. Now, here's something really interesting about that. If you look at modern psychology and you look at the form of psychotherapy, which has proven to be among the conventional psychotherapies, right, which have proven to be the most effective in helping those who depress and anxietize, it's metacognitive therapy. And metacognitive is a so-called third wave cognitive therapy, where instead of so much trying to change the content of your thinking or disputing your philosophies, it's more about learning to see thoughts as thoughts and learning to leave your experience alone. It's mostly about helping people to reduce their levels of rumination, to have less rumination and less worry. So the metacognitive therapists are really skilled at helping people to reduce their levels of worry and threat monitoring and rumination, and to help people to realize that they don't really need to do anything about their thinking and feeling. They can leave it alone. They teach this thing called detached mindfulness. Now, the metacognitive therapists are often quite proud and say, look, we are the first people to do this and the first people to emphasize this. But they're wrong. Sydney Banks in the 70s actually emphasized the exact same stuff. And I do think that when you look at the effectiveness of metacognitive therapy in helping people reduce their suffering, um, it's a lot of the same thing that happens when people get into the three principles and they kind of learn to leave their thinking and feeling alone. So, and here's something really great too. You know, Sydney Banks made the claim that the only thing going on when people struggle with so-called mental illnesses is that they misunderstand the nature of thought. And that behind that understanding, we essentially sit in mental health. We sit in love and clarity and peace of mind, and that is our fundamental nature. He uses the analogy of, when there's an intelligence behind life, that when you scrape your knee or cut your finger or get a cold, there's an intelligence inside of you that works to correct that. And in the same way, the mind is self-regulating if you leave it alone. The metacognitive therapy folks also kind of emphasize this, but they don't have that spiritual bent. They have more of a materialist, conventional view of the world. But also there is this assumption that innately we're fine. We're just caught up in our thinking. And I think this is so much more a useful frame because it kind of assumes that our nature, our being is basically healthy, and that we tend to kind of seemingly think our way out of it, versus the kind of typical psychiatric framework that presupposes that we have these illnesses or these diseases or that's basically our nature when we struggle, and that we can learn to cope or to treat. So this turns that paradigm completely upside down. So in addition to helping people not only change their relationship to their thinking, but to see the role of thought itself, it's a bit more profound and deep, I would say, than the metacognitive therapist, because the metacognitive therapists are more about learning to kind of spot the rumination or see thoughts as thoughts. The three principles is more about discovering the fact that you're thinking. So if we take that movie analogy again, not so much about being aware of each scene in the movie as a thought, but just knowing that the entire movie is basically made of thought to begin with. So it points to something a bit deeper. Something else that often tends to happen, if you look at people like Eckhart Tolle and Byron Katie and spiritual teachers, what they tend to point people towards is, I would say, often a differentiation between being and thinking. So less of an identification with the kind of self-referential narrative of the mind, and instead more of an identification with consciousness itself, or being itself, or life itself. And that tends to be extremely useful for people, because then thoughts and feelings look less like who we are, becomes less threatening. We feel less fragmented and isolated and vulnerable in that sense, when there's an identification with mind at large, or life itself, versus the egoic mind, if you will. So those are the two big things, I think, that three principles coaches kind of often help people see when they point in this direction: a different form of like self-identification, and really understanding the nature of thought. And there's a lot of positive stuff here. And what I think differentiates Sydney Banks' teachings from all these other modalities is that he kind of posited this as principles. And he really emphasized the role of thought in experience, and the principle of thought as kind of the source of experience. And this is not done in the same way in Buddhist teachings or other spiritual teachers, except for Byron Katie, as far as I can see. They tend more to talk about conditioning and trauma and childhood events but the three principles totally, I would say, bypasses that in a positive way. Also, when you look at a lot of the meditation world and the awakening industry, if you will, there's so many people there who seem to have what's called dark nights of the soul, deep, tremendous amounts of nihilism and suffering and existential crisis. Um, and as far as I can see, this isn't really common in the three principles world, even though people are kind of pointed in the same direction. So that's a huge, big plus. Something else, too, so much of the meditation and, as I said, awakening world seems to be steeped in really outdated, old psychodynamic Freudian ideas of repression and repressed memories and repressed feelings and trauma and everything being trauma. And the three principles world does not go into this stuff at all. And as a result of that, people don't seem to be struggling with that stuff. That's awesome as well. A couple of other big pluses here. Um, as I said, when I started to explore the three principles world, I had a lot of experience with different forms of psychotherapy and also neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis. And I was used to, especially in the neurolinguistic programming and hypnosis worlds, for teachers to often be quite competitive, really sharp elbows, hostile humor. They often came across as technicians, in a sense, clever technicians, not necessarily wise, integrated human beings who seemed happy and to have their shit together. The vibe was very different for the most part when I started to study or go to seminars with these three principles teachers. I saw very little hostile humor. They didn't badmouth other teachers. They seemed happier. They seemed lighter. There was more often this kind of grandfatherly type of energy of someone who really wanted the best for you. And I saw very little of the kind of narcissistic types of displays that are often, very often at play if you look in many non duality and meditation circles. It seems as if teachers and people who kind of go through the ranks in that world often have more than their fair share of these kind of dark triad personality tendencies. I saw little of that in the three principles world. Now I'm sugarcoating things as well because I'm not really part of those communities. I don't know any of these people like personally outside of the seminar scene. So I'm very sure that if you could follow these people around and see their personal lives, you'd probably see conflicts and you see people not walking their talk, and you'd probably see a lot of stuff behind the scenes. So I don't mean to completely sugarcoat it, but I think there is, on balance, a different vibe and a different attitude, right? So, but what about weaknesses? And I I kind of tend to agree with the three principles. So I don't think the weaknesses lie in presenting mind, consciousness, and thought as principles per se. But some of the implications that Sid would teach and that people teach, I think can be problematic. So the first thing that occurred to me was that, hey, yes, you don't need to work on thoughts. No, you don't need any techniques. Yes, thought itself is neutral, so techniques have no power. But there seems to be a rigidity often amongst many three principles coaches and teachers that they completely reject anything not from the three principles world and anything that kind of smells of techniques. But consider this: if someone goes to see a three principles coach, and the three principles coach is telling stories and using pointers and analogies, hopefully to help someone have an insight, what might be going on internally for the student might not be any different than what would happen if someone guided them through, let's say, an eyes closed process. So in the psychological illusion model that I teach, that's just the name for my particular way of working with people. I often engage in, yes, storytelling and metaphors and stuff like that, but quite a few thought experiments and change artistry inspired from my days of hypnosis and NLP, not as techniques to change people's experience, but just as these kind of experiments to help people have insights, right? So that, in my experience, can be very useful. Something else that I think is kind of a limitation here to some extent is that, as Jack Pransky said, our nature is love, peace, and happiness with the power to create the illusion that we're not. There's, you see, when people in, for example, the non-duality or spiritual worlds or meditation worlds, when people like Rupert Spira, for example, says that, being or consciousness, its nature is peace and love. Those words are used somewhat differently than when people use it in the conventional psychological realm. So love just means that there is no other. That all distinctions are created by thinking. So it's just the lack of an other, right? And when it says that our nature is peace, it just means that being or consciousness itself, since it has no objective qualities, doesn't lack anything, right? So we can claim this to be true, but here would be my question for you. So if mind at large is the source of all things, and there is no other, meaning it's all one thing, and we can call that love, what's the nature of a tiger? Is the nature of a tiger in nature love? Or is it quite predatory, even though it doesn't conceive itself to be predatory, right? Is the basis for the tiger acting in a predatory way that they misunderstand the nature of thought, or that they have too much self-referential thinking? I think there's if you look at life, as Tony Parsons once said, oneness gassed the Jews. If there's just one energy expressing itself as seemingly distinct waves, seemingly distinct Nazis and Jews and prison camp guards, oneness did indeed gas the Jews. So when you look at the state of the world and how we treat each other, it seems a bit Pollyanna-ish to make that claim. I'll cover a couple of other things here. So Sid Banks used to talk about, negative feelings being a kind of warning sign that you're misusing the power of thought, and to always follow the good feeling, right? And if you follow the good feeling, there's wisdom. I certainly agree that if we are in a state of mind with little agitation and clarity, then what seems to come through is more often useful. But you can feel great. You can feel in flow and still be completely deluded. There's examples of interviews with suicide bombers whose vests failed to detonate, who before they intended to kill themselves and others, were convinced that they were acting out of love, out of Allah's wishes, and convinced that the next time they would open their eyes, they would be, you know, one with their Father in heaven, so to speak. They were not driven by hatred or clearly, this is an example of being deluded. There's a book I highly recommend. It's called Full Frontal Murder, a memoir. And this is about the Herbert Weinstein case, not Harvey Weinstein, but Herbert Weinstein. And Herbert Weinstein killed his wife and pushed her out of a window in New York back in 1991. This was the case that kind of brought neuroscience into the courtrooms. And the interesting thing about it was that Herbert Weinstein could easily have come across as an enlightened person. He was unflappable. He had no fear. He was never irritated. He was never sad. He was always in a good mood, always beaming. When people asked him, "How are you?" he would say, "Excellent," and it's just getting better. Like he lived from that place, and his daughter, his kids in the memoir said that they never saw him lose his cool. They never saw him in a negative state. Even in court, after he had killed his wife, he killed his wife quite spontaneously after she kind of scratched him and attacked him. So he basically killed her and calculated that if I throw her out the window, it might look like a suicide. But even in court, he was beaming. In prison, he was beaming. So, but Herbert Weinstein was not enlightened or awakened. He had a giant cyst pushing on his frontal lobes that had been growing over the years that likely contributed to this. That this was the result of brain damage. You have Shinsen Young in his book The Signs of Enlightenment talks about these brain pathologies that can kind of mimic no self as thing. It talks about something called athymorphia, which is a particular form of stroke with these kind of symmetrical lesions, which makes it so that people are not able to construct a sense of agency or a sense of selfhood from the inside. But it can be activated when someone kind of talks to them from the outside. So he writes about examples of someone swimming and just having no motivation to essentially not sink until someone started talking to the person, or another person who had these massive sunburns by sitting in the sun and having no motivation whatsoever to get out of the sun until someone dragged her out of there. And she was asked afterwards, did it hurt? And she said, "Oh yes, intensely," but she didn't perceive it to be a problem. So there are particular strokes and neurological conditions and cysts and stuff like that can kind of mimic or create the same sort of perceptual shifts, right? This can be the result of brain pathology. The neuroscientist Jill Bolte Taylor writes about this in her book, My Stroke of Insight. So just because someone seems to have no attachments or no fear and they're kind of unflappable and completely present and in flow, that does not necessarily mean that they're coming from a place of wisdom, or that what's going to come through is necessarily coming from a healthy place. It could come from a place of brain pathology. Back to the tiger, the predator. Consider the problem of psychopathy. People who have a set of personality tendencies where there's usually a kind of callousness, coldness, lack of affect, essentially, lack of an emotional range, very low neuroticism, meaning they're basically fearless, and a high degree of impulsivity. Someone who operates from that place too, essentially, has no attachments per se. They're not fearful. They're not anxious. They're not lost in thought, right? But they're still predators and parasites. So, and there are anecdotally, people in the meditation world who have had profound awakenings into there being no such thing as a self and these sorts of things, who still seem to be just as psychopathic or just as narcissistic. So these types of insights don't necessarily change those forms of personality tendencies, right? This idea too that if just the personal thinking slows down enough, that what's going to speak through you is just pure wisdom from the source, so to speak. Well, even if someone's, again, mind has slowed down and they're in flow and they have clarity, does not necessarily mean that what's going to flow through is going to be useful or necessarily come from a healthy place. You have the examples that I just mentioned. You know, and look, everything occurs through the one process of life, including the selfing personal narrative, including the gassing of Jews. Another thing here too that Sydney Banks used to emphasize was that we have free will and that we are the thinker. Now this is not accurate, right? Because the thinker itself is just another thought. There's no thinker behind the thoughts. It's not so much that we don't have free will. It's more that the flip side of seeing that there is no such thing as a self. There is no one really to have it, right? So I think religious teachings very often emphasize free will, because if you emphasize the free will of the alleged individual, then God can reign supreme as all-knowing and all-loving. You see, the problem is just how the person uses his or her free will. But if you see that whole thing of free will as illusory, it's really hard then to have this idea of a all-knowing, all-loving God. Because the only way you could say that our nature is peace and love and oneness, essentially, but the reason for gassing the Jews is the egocentric thinking of certain individuals who kind of misuse the power of thought or misuse their free will. But if you kind of see that there is no thinker in there who's doing the thinking, then you kind of have to acknowledge that everything that emerges out of the same source. And that includes the belly laughs, and it includes gassing the Jews. Something else too, there's a psychopathy and altruism researcher called Abigail Marsh, who was very interested both in psychopathy and extreme altruism. And she would study these people who anonymously donated, one of their kidneys, didn't get paid for it, didn't get public recognition, just this pure act of kindness and altruism, right? And these people were like the antidote to the psychopaths. Now, the psychopaths always had small amygdalas. Now, amygdalas aren't the fear center of the brain, but they're kind of the threat center of the brain. So psychopaths are the ones who score high on psychopathy are essentially fearless, and they tend to have very small amygdalas and somewhat different neural wiring to us neurotypicals, to use that tendency. The people who were these extreme altruists, they had much larger amygdalas and better ability to recognize fear from facial expressions and in their own body. They weren't the most neurotic people. So the most generous and altruistic folks were typically not the most neurotic folks, but it was not the people who had the greatest fear response either. It was people who had, something there in the middle. So I think that also kind of puts a wrench into this idea that if people could just essentially lose their self-referential thinking and have no anxiety or self-referential fears, then what would come through them would just be essentially acts of love and kindness and compassion. So I think you have the problem of psychopathy. You have the issue of evil. Essentially, I think the three principles communities kind of markets a Pollyanna-ish view of human nature, right? Um, and I think anyone who studies the principles might also want to look into some evolutionary psychology as well as a kind of antidote to get a more balanced view on human nature, right? Uh, so anyways, I hope this was useful. I hope this was interesting. Know that I see clients from all over the world online, and I also do mentoring. So if there's some change you'd like to make in your life, and you wonder whether you and I could be a good fit, feel free to drop me an email at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2025, know that I have a seminar coming up very soon about how to integrate meditation and mindfulness practices in your client work and your change work. And this autumn, I'm going to do a awakening course. So look out for that as well. I'm very curious to hear to what extent you might agree or disagree with this particular criticism. Until then, thanks for listening.